again, Sunshines. Welcome to part 1 on chapter 20, Genetics and Human Inheritance. So this is our second chapter on genetics. The first one we looked at cell division. Now we're going to look at inheritance, how we pass on traits, how they're coded, how they get expressed. So what is a trait? A trait is a characteristic. So this lovely child, this is my son about a year ago. So what traits does he have? His earlobes are unattached. He does not have a widow's peak. He's got dimples that you can't see. So those traits are coded by genes. Okay. So alleles are different forms of a gene. So these are homologous chromosomes. So if you remember that, that's like mom chromosome 1 and dad chromosome 1. They have the same genes on there, but the code isn't the same necessarily. So their gene could produce one protein and the other could produce something else. So alleles are the different forms of those genes, what they can code for. So an example that your book likes to use, and is fun because I have them, is freckles. So freckles are dominant. If you have one gene, you have freckles. Okay, so this gene right here in pink we can say is for freckles. And now you could have two different alleles though. So this one could code for freckles, and that allele could not code for freckles. All right? Exciting. So you can describe your alleles as homozygous or heterozygous. So homo, same. So you have two identical alleles. So two that code for freckles, two that don't, right? On each chromosome. Oppositely, hetero, different, two different alleles. So now if you have two different alleles, you can see one being expressed and one not oftentimes. And what we would call that is dominant and recessive. So if I have a freckle coding allele and a non-freckle coding allele, I'm heterozygous. But if you look at my physical characteristics, I have freckles. So the freckle allele masks the no freckles. So we would say freckles are dominant to non-freckle genes. And we'll look at this more in heterozygotes. And we give them a capital letter. Whereas recessive is the masked or not visible allele. So this only works on genes or traits that are based on one gene, right? If you have more, then it gets more complicated. So your genotype is the alleles that are present, whereas your phenotype is the physical characteristic expressed. So over here, right, freckles dominate no freckles. So FF, homozygous dominant, you have freckles, right? The heterozygous, big F, little f, you still have freckles because the freckles mask the non. Whereas homozygous recessive, no freckles, then you don't have freckles. So this woman either has big F or big F little f. We can't tell by looking at her what her genotype is. Whereas this guy with no freckles, we know has to be heterozygous recessive. He does not have a gene for freckles, otherwise we would see it, right? Same idea with widow's peak. That's dominant to no widow's peak. Unattached earlobes are dominant to attached. So I've got attached earlobes. I know I'm little e. And tongue rolling, dominant to not being able to tongue roll. So, ooh, this is fun. So, dad can roll his tongue. Mom can't. So he's big T, or big T, little t. And mom has to be little t, right? She can't do it. So their son can. So he has to be big T, little t. because he got the little t from mom. That's all she can pass on. And he can do it. So we got the big T from dad. Pretty exciting. If they had another kid and the kid could not roll their tongue, then they'd know that dad has to be big T, little t to pass on that little t. Pretty cool. So what we're describing here is basically Mendelian genetics. So Gregor Mendel was a monk in the 1800s in what was Austria then, and I think it's what, Czechoslovakia now? Oh God, no, Czech Republic. Whew, don't test my history, please. And he did experiments on pea plants. And so what he would do is he would get these homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and breed them together. And then he would know that all of the next gene is heterozygous. So he would look at then those crosses and see what the percentages were of peas with the different traits. So he could look at how the flowers were positioned, the color, the height, the pea shape, the color, the pea pod shape, the pea pod color. So all of those are controlled by individual genes, and he learned a lot about predictions of percentages. You can't really do this with people very well because they would have to have a lot of kids to get like accurate representations. But we can look at the likelihood of having different traits. And we do that by using a Punnett square to see what different outcomes are possible. So what we do is we put the parents' genotypes, and then we see what they can hand off to their offspring. Okay. So this guy we said was little f, right? No freckles. So 50% of the time he's going to pass on that little f, 50% this little f. But so now here are our options, little f, little f. Now we're going to assume, maybe we looked at more of her family trait, that she is big F, big F. She's got 2 copies for freckles. So 50-50 chance she sends each of those along. All right, I guess I should put that there. So now what you do is you carry those down. And so big F across. Big F across. And little f down, little f down. So in their case, if they had offspring and those were their genotypes, there are 4 squares here, so those are the 4 options for their kids, and there's an equal likelihood of each of those happening, and they are all 4 out of 4 heterozygous for freckles. So all of their kids would have freckles, right? Oop, I don't know why I put a T there. But now, if you take the other reason why this doesn't work so well with humans is it requires crossbreeding of siblings, not usually socially acceptable in humans. Okay, so a lot of the times we'll use flies or plants, right? So a monohybrid cross is where we're looking at one trait, one gene, of heterozygous. Okay. So here, both of these individuals have freckles. We're going to hope they're not siblings. And so both of them are heterozygous, big F, little f. So now there's a 50% chance for each of them that they pass on their big F for freckles or their little f for none. So now let's trace this across. So big F, big F, big F, little f, big F, little f, little f, little f. Okay. So what we see here, let's change this color. We've got one of the 4 that is homozygous dominant. They have freckles, all their kids will have freckles, right? And then we've got 2, not that color, that are heterozygous, but they're still going to have freckles because they have that big trait, right? And then there's one that will not have freckles. Oh, I probably should use it, right? Let's choose a different color. There we go. So genotypic ratio of offspring. Let's look at what we mean by that. Okay. So here we've got 1 big F to 2 to 1, right? 1, 2, 1. The phenotypic ratio, we can't tell by looking at these kids what they are, what their genotypes are, but phenotypes, 3 of them have freckles to 1 without. Freckles to no freckles. Does that make sense? Hope so. So what we used here was a Punnett square, right? We saw that on the last page. We took their possible outcomes and saw what they sent on. So now let's get real tricky here, and we'll do a dihybrid cross. So now we're going to look at 2 traits. We're going to look at freckles and widow's peaks. Ooh. So both of them are hybrids for each. So F, F, W, W. Okay. And that one F looks too uppercase. Should pick something that's easier like B's. Okay. So each time there's a 50-50 chance they'll pass on big F, little f, big W, little w. So we're going to put those up here. So let's say FW, 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 FW. Okay, and same thing here. Okay. So now let's do this. Okay. Can I write this in here? F, F, W, W, F, F, W, W, F, F, W, W, F, W, W. So if we look at this whole row, there's a big F in each, so they all have freckles, and there is a big W in each, so they all have a widow's peak, right? Okay, now let's keep going. F, F, W, F, F, little w, big, little, big, little, big, little, little, little. Ooh. So here we're getting some differences. So now 2 of those have straight hairlines, no widow's peak. Okay. Don't get too excited yet. Oh, that should be a little. You can tell. And now 2 of them have no freckles. And I did these in the same order as the book. I was going to check and I didn't. So this is really exciting. I was just going to see how it went. And then, ooh. So these boxes show what we'll get. So Frex and widow's peak